It's my privilege right now to welcome you to our first session and introduce to you two of our state winners. First up, we have the 2021 Delaware Sportscaster of the Year, Gary Laing, representing HRSN. He's the primary radio play-by-play voice of Delaware State Hornets football, men's and women's basketball, and also runs the streaming network of HRSN, specializing in coverage of HBCU sports. We also have our 2021 Tennessee Sportswriter of the Year, Maurice Patton, representing Main Street Preps Columbia. Gary and Maurice are going to be talking to you this morning about small market sports coverage, why it matters, and how you should prepare. Many folks, when they start out in this business, will end up in a small market. Some people will specialize in small market sports coverage for the entirety of their career. So it's important that you're familiar with these concepts. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Gary.
Thank you. Save that for the end. We'll see how you feel in an hour. Maurice, good to meet you.
You as well.
We contacted each other through email this week, and I wrote to Maurice and I said, first time at NSMA. We're going to do this presentation the first morning. Maybe we could strategize a little bit on what we can do, and I'll base it on your experience. And he answered back, it's my first time also, so we'll figure it out when we get there. But I do have some ideas about how to work in a small market because I've been in the Dover, Delaware area since 1973. Dover is, if you were to rank it as a market, and I don't think the government even does that, or Arbitron does it, would be down in the low 200s. But I've managed to make a career out of there. Sports has always been that second job. In a market like Dover, you're never going to make a living out of sports as the main job, though there are sports writers who do. But from the broadcast side, it doesn't happen. I went to Dover to work in the news department of a radio station in 1973 and started there on August 8th. A couple of days later, the program director came in and asked me how things were going during my first week, and I told him I was pretty comfortable, I was fine. And then asked, do you ever do any local sports around here, like high school football or anything? He said, we sure do. Now, I had done basketball and some other things while I was in college, and just a couple of years before. And he said, yeah, he said, we do high school football. I said, well, if you ever need any help, I do have some experience broadcasting sports. And he said, oh, okay, I'll keep that in mind. 10 minutes later, he came back to the newsroom and said, what are you doing Friday night? And I said, Friday night? He said, yeah, we have a game, and I need somebody to do color. We have a play-by-play guy who's been doing it for a number of years, but I need a color commentator, and you actually have to set up the equipment and handle that because he doesn't know anything about that. Well, I can do that. He said, great. You're on for Friday night. It's $25 a game. Not bad considering I was being paid $4.50 a month. So, any opportunity to make some extra bucks was welcome. 10 minutes later, he came back into the newsroom and he said, how would you feel about doing the entire season? And I quickly multiplied 10 times 25 and said, you've got your man. And I've been working sports in Dover area ever since. 13 seasons with that station, doing that local high school, then some other fill-ins and things, and then the local cable company began televising games, and I was contacted and asked if I wanted to work with them. They told me what they'd pay, and I said yes, and ended up with a full-time job in their advertising sales department. Who knew in 1987 that you could put local ads on CNN and ESPN? Very few people knew that. But I quickly learned how to sell it and make a pretty good living out of it for the next 8 years. But continued doing the televised games, tape delay high school games, and some college stuff as well. And when that ended, did 2 years just high school football games for a fellow who was trying to keep high school football on the air locally. Not much money in it, but he was a friend from church, and he was interested in keeping high school football on the air. And then HSRN happened. And the reason that happened was because a fellow who had been my color commentator for a few years on the televised games is now the CEO of HSRN, and he was looking to expand what they were doing and called me up and said, "Are you available?" And I said, "Oddly enough, I am." And I've had a ball working for him. But it's all been working out of Dover, Delaware, a small market. Though HSRN is expanding, we do have the rights to Delaware State University. And because we are internet-based and you can listen to the games on the internet or download our app, when you go to it, it will give you a choice of the games that we are carrying that particular day. We had our conference call on Tuesday, and I learned that right now we are contracted with 11 different HBCUs for this football season. Some we will originate the games, and others we will pick up from their local broadcaster and put it out on the internet, distributing it essentially worldwide. We'll also have a game of the week on Sirius XM. So while we're a small market, where we're based out of, we've got a global reach. What I'm going to tell you is the first lesson, please write this down, when I teach the radio and television announcing class at Delaware State University. Let me give you this so you can chime in, and I'll work this microphone for now. I teach radio and television announcing at Delaware State University, and the first thing I teach my students is something that was taught to me by my first program director at a commercial radio station. He said, "Young man," and at the time I did qualify as a young man. I don't give much advice, but this I will tell you, and it will help you many times. Always keep your turntables covered. Now, for a few years when I taught at Delaware State, I had to explain what turntables were because everything had gone digital. Now we're coming back to turntables and vinyl, and I couldn't be happier. Us old guys still have some of the advantages. And what he meant was always be ready for something to go wrong. If you're sitting there and you have two turntables in the studio and one is playing a record, the next one better be ready with that next record because something could go wrong. A record skips, something happens, and you've got to fill that time quickly. And I saw guys over my career who didn't have their turntables covered and would scramble as a song was ending or a record would start to skip what they were going to do next. But he also said, apply it to life. Keep your turntables covered. What could go wrong? What are you going to do to make it go right? So I always teach that first. Keep your turntables covered. Be ready for what could go wrong. Are you sitting in the radio station on a Thursday and they tell you there's going to be a staff meeting on Friday? And the general manager comes in and says, well, guys, the station's been sold. New owners take possession Monday, and the format changes. It's going Spanish language. Who here teaches and speaks Spanish? In my case, I'd be looking at him and saying, I guess I don't come to work on Monday. Now, you get a feel that maybe something's going to happen, that the station's up for sale. It's never a surprise. You always get notice on it. But what are you going to do if the possibility is there that there's no job for you when that station's sold? And I've been at stations that have been sold. Fortunately, made it through the sale process, but the aftermath, sometimes things change. So always be ready for something to change. Make the change be what you want it to be. That's what happens in small markets. It also happens in medium and major markets. I had a friend who was working in Chicago, and his station was on the 18th floor of a building in downtown Chicago. There were 4 other radio stations in that same building. On different floors, they were competing, and he said when the ratings would come out, you would actually get in the elevator and talk to a guy who said, you know, there's an opening up on the 17th floor. I just got fired. He was heading down to the 4th floor because he heard there was an opening at a station there where they had just let people go for low ratings. Always be ready for something to happen. That doesn't change whether you're working in a small, medium, or large market, or you're with a network. Something's going to happen to change, and you need to be ready for it. How you prepare for it, keeping your ears open, doing your networking among your peers, making sure that your resume is up to date so that if you need to hand it out this afternoon, you don't have to go back and change anything in it. should be up to date every day. And making sure you have tape, video, audio, and I still use the word tape even though what we would do is send out digital. What can you send out that's current, that shows you to your best? So that if that opportunity comes up immediately and somebody said, well, I've got an opening, but you know, I need an application, you don't need 3 days to get it ready to send it to them. Because by then it's too late. It moves too quickly. It moves too quickly. So be ready for whatever happens. Again, we're supposed to talk about small markets and why it's important and how to prepare small market sports coverage. I'll stop in a moment and turn it over to Maurice to let him talk about it from the print side. But it's preparation. It's preparation. Being ready for whatever could happen. And when you're on the air and you're doing your sports program, it's preparation. I do a tremendous amount of preparation before every game I do. I estimate that for every hour I'm going to be broadcasting the game live, I'm doing 2 hours of prep work. I have information on my iPad in a format on every player in that game. Basketball, maybe I don't have to do as much prep work. Football, maybe a little bit more because I've got 90 players on each side. And I want to have something to say about every one of those players. Offensive player, offensive lineman. How often do you have to say something about them? Not often, but I don't know when it will happen. So I want to be ready for it. Preparation. My wife looked at my preparation one day and she said, my God, that's a lot of information you have there. How much of that do you think you'll use? And I said, in the extreme, 10%. Why do you prepare that much? What was my answer? What do you think I said? Preparation. I'll be ready. When I get there, I don't know which 10% I'm going to use. The game will tell me what I use. And I had a game last year, our team had a big lead over a school that's not an NCAA school, it's not an NIA school, it's an independent, and I compare them to the Washington Generals who always play the Harlem Globetrotters. Have game, have money, they'll come and play. Right. It was a blowout. Second game of the season, and we had our third and fourth string freshman quarterbacks in the game. Did I have anything to say about them? They had no stats at the university. Yes, I did. I was able to talk about what they did in high school, how the previous season they were in a championship game for their division in high school. When I started doing games in 1970, couldn't have done that. Probably couldn't have done it 20 years ago. But the internet has so much information now. Every university has their roster online, and there's always information there about these players. Do your homework. Get online. Find out. Don't be trying to find it during the game. Oh my God, the fourth string quarterback's in the game. What can I find about him here? All I had to do was scroll on my iPad, and there was my information that this player had been in his high school division championship game the year before. Was that important? No, not to the extent of it was information that the listener had to know, but it sure made it more interesting for the listener instead of saying, we're down to our fourth string quarterback and I don't know a damn thing about him. You don't want to be there. So do your homework, prepare. Turntables covered? Sure, I didn't know the fourth string quarterback was going to get many games that season, and by the way, it was the only minutes he played all year. It was the only minutes the third string quarterback played all year either. But they got their due. They got their notice. When they came in, somebody was able to say something positive about them. And if they had had to come back in later in the season, I would have had even some more information. I would have had the stats from those 6 minutes that they played. Small market? Yeah. It's harder, but it's something you have to do because you'll learn that preparation. You'll learn what information you have to have together. Whether you're doing play-by-play or a studio show, you'll learn what you have to have. You'll learn how to prepare. It's professionalism. And that's what you learn in a small market, is professionalism. Nobody goes into a small market as a pro, but you better come out of a small market as a pro. You better learn how to be a professional, and that's one of the things that I like to impart to people, that preparation. You can't go into it cold. You can't just sit down in the seat. People think, oh, I could do that. It's easy. And over the years, I've had some people who managed to get the job as a color announcer with me, and a lot of them only lasted one game. They wouldn't come back. They thought they knew the game, they thought they knew the sport, they thought they knew the team, and they found out they didn't know enough because they didn't prepare. And even on the network level, I've seen and heard former players, well-known players, who come in as a color analyst. It's very obvious that the only thing they did to prepare for that game was find out what time their flight left. They weren't prepared for that game. They were going to try to fly based on their experience as a player. And you can only do that for so long. And then it becomes obvious the job's not for you. Not for them, because they're not prepared to do that particular game. Well, they're knowledgeable about the sport. They're not prepared to do that particular game. So they either get told by the network, learn your preparation and start doing it, or they're out of the booth. And that happens a lot. Maurice, you talk about how for your particular part of the industry.
Well, can y'all hear me? Yeah, okay. So a lot of what Gary said, even though he comes at it from an electronic standpoint, applies to print as well. Preparation and professionalism. I've been fortunate enough, I guess, to have worked both in small markets and in major markets. Spent 24 and a half years of my career working at the major metropolitan daily in the Nashville, Middle Tennessee area. So a lot of experience there, but before I got there and since I left there, I've been in small markets. And you can't big time it because people know that, well, he's only here because X. You know, you've got to embrace it. It's going to be a lot easier if you do. People are going to be more willing to work with you if they realize that you care about where you are. And that goes back to what Gary said about preparation and professionalism. You made a comment about someone felt like it was important to have high school football games on the radio. You're going to run into that a lot in small markets. Things are going to be important to somebody. It's not necessarily that it's a moneymaker or it drives anything, but that community support, it's important to that community that those things be exposed, whether it be high school football or high school girls soccer or whatever else it is. You know, they want that coverage. And a lot of times, if you are at a small market publication in particular, you're going to be the only ones covering them. So it's important to that community. It's important to those programs. It's important to those kids. I cover primarily high schools. Where I'm at now, I cover 14 high schools and a community college primarily. And if we didn't, they wouldn't. So you have to realize that. And one thing that a young coach told a young reporter that stuck with me years and years and more years ago is make the big time where you are. You know, don't treat it like it's small market just because it is. They know it. You know it. Doesn't mean you can't make that the most important thing. And again, that goes back to preparation and professionalism. And there was a saying, I guess, you know, in the pandemic and everything, it's not as important now, but, you know, dress for the job you want, not the job you have. You take that same approach to how you go about the job that you have, I think. I think you just have to, you don't worry about, or I don't worry about small market, major market, whatever. I just do the job the best I can, regardless of where I am. And I think if you do that, you're going to be prepared whatever market it is that you're in. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. Tom, I completely agree.
Okay. All right. You know, as Gary said, I didn't do a whole lot of preparation. It looks like Gary has. I've not had time. I had a newspaper to get out. But, that's my biggest thing, really. Just you do the work regardless of where you are, and because it's important to somebody. You know, whether you're working in Nashville or whether you're working in Columbia, Tennessee, which is about 45 minutes south. You know, whether you're writing the same story that 6 other people are writing, or whether you're writing a story that nobody else is going to write because nobody else knows about it. You know, but you've got to take that professionalism to that and realize that what you're writing, what you're broadcasting is important to somebody. And, you know, don't blow it off. Don't be like, whatever. You know, it's going in some, trust me. We talk about scrapbook journalism. And I think there's a lot more of that maybe in small markets. But somebody's grandmother or somebody's aunt or somebody is cutting out some article that you're writing and putting it in some 16-year-old scrapbook for him to show to his grandchildren later on, or her to show to her grandchildren 20, 30 years later. So it's important. And so that's where the preparation and the professionalism comes in. Don't wait until you get a job in a major market to take that approach, because you might not. So.
Maurice, how did you get into the business? How did you?
That's funny. So in high school, well, going back to middle school, I helped start my junior high school newspaper. I helped start my high school newspaper. But I also took 2 years of accounting in high school, and I was pretty good with numbers. So I figured I'd major in business/accounting in college. 3 senior level courses later, I figured that wasn't my path. So I was also working as a student worker in the sports information office at Middle Tennessee State. And at a baseball game my junior year, I had a guy ask me, you know, what are you doing this summer? I said, well, I'm retaking a couple of accounting classes. Why do you ask? We've got a part-time opening at the local newspaper, the Daily News Journal. And so I started writing there, continued writing there, didn't graduate in accounting, had a sister 6 years younger than me who was getting ready to go to school, and I needed to get off the family payroll. So started working at a small tri-weekly in my hometown and been at it ever since, well, with the exception of a couple of layoffs. So, but again, I started at a small market newspaper while I was in college, worked at a tri-weekly for 3 years before I got to the Tennessean in '90. Got laid off in '14, thanks Gannett, and started a high school-based website, pretty much on my own. Went to the Columbia paper, which was owned by Gatehouse when I got there in October of '16. Gatehouse purchased Gannett in November of '19. I'm like, here we go again. Sure enough, April of '20, right as the pandemic started, got laid off there. Started another website, did that for about 15 months, got absorbed by Main Street Media, which owns about a dozen publications and websites in and around Nashville, and started up Main Street Murray, which is a weekly newspaper with a strong website presence in and around the Columbia area, which again is about 45 minutes out of Nashville. So we cover a lot of the stuff that the Nashville market doesn't necessarily deal with. but, and I think we cover it pretty well, so. But, does that answer your question? Yeah. Most of us, certainly of my age, I guess, I think things are a little different now, but most of us got our start in small markets. Some graduated up, some didn't, some shouldn't have. But I think when you get that start in small markets, you can learn a lot that can be applied, again, anywhere. The professionalism, again, I just keep coming back to that word, and I hate that Gary used it first, but
Should have gone first.
but no, but it's so important. I mean, whatever it is you're doing, there's a way you can do things that creates respect for what you do and how you go about your business. And if that's the one thing that you can take away, be a professional. Take what you do seriously. Don't necessarily take yourself seriously, but take what you do seriously because it means something. So, yes, sir.
I have a question regarding smaller market versus larger. You said in a larger market, a story is going to be covered by several entities, but in a smaller market, you might be the only person who has that opportunity. So when it's something that's like a difficult story or a personal story that maybe you're on the fence about, how do you cover something like that? For instance, I'll give you an example. I cover local high school basketball teams. The one coach, I heard whispers that he had a drug addiction, had an overdose. He didn't die, thankfully, but he had to step down from his job. It was something that I didn't know if I should put that out there. I didn't. Someone else did. And then I later tried contacting the coach, I had a good relationship with. He basically ignored me. So I didn't get any of the story. Someone else did. But I also felt not particularly comfortable from the start with it because if he didn't, want to talk to me, I didn't know if I should put it out there. For something like that, how do you approach it knowing potentially you might be the only person who has that information?
Sometimes you have to write uncomfortable stories, and in small markets they're even more uncomfortable because you have such a relationship with the people. In a major market, you may deal with that person once every 6 months, once a year, never. I had to write an article once about a guy who got popped in a prostitution sting at a Christian school. Not a lot of fun. 5 years later, he finally started talking to me again. To your point, sometimes you have to make a personal decision. Am I going to write this story, or am I going to run the risk of getting beat? And can I live with the consequences of either? And I've probably gotten beat on some stories that I felt like were too difficult to write, and I've probably written some stories that I didn't want to write. But sometimes you owe it to yourself, again, as a professional, to write those stories. And if it's out in the community that strong that this is what took place, you try to substantiate it. You don't write what you heard. You write what you know. You make sure that you can get somebody. I mean, there's somebody that knows why he resigned. But also, you probably, you don't need me to tell you this, but you probably should have made that phone call first if you had a relationship with the guy. Sometimes you have to leverage those relationships. And I will tell you that if you have those relationships with those people, bottom line, they will appreciate you handling the story rather than somebody dipping in, hammering them, dipping out, because they know you care about them, because you built that relationship on the front end before he resigned and before the drug addiction or whatever else. He knew that you cared about him, and so he takes that phone call. So,
Just to add on to that, and having worked in a radio newsroom and being the news director, there's a sports story and then there's a news story. All right, the sports story is the Friday night football game, the Saturday afternoon basketball game at the high school. That's the sports story. But what about if you weren't the sports reporter for that publication? What if you were just a staff reporter doing news, how would you have handled that story? Would you have backed off from it, or would you have gone after it? That was a news story. That transcended the sports portion of it. So now you've got to be the journalist. Now you have to be the reporter covering that news story that just happens to touch on sports. What if he hadn't been the coach? What if he'd just been a teacher at the school, the principal at the school? How would you have handled that? So for the future, that may help you in your guidance of how to deal with that kind of situation, whether it be at a high school, private or public, or the local college, or even a local professional team, and you know something about that person. How will you handle that story? Because it goes out of the area of sports and becomes news. And even more important these days, when we have 24-hour sports networks that can't just keep regurgitating scores, so now we're hearing everything about the athletes that we didn't used to hear about the athletes. Because the beat reporter who covered the team had to keep his credentials, had to continue covering that team, and so they held back on certain things. We didn't know till years later just how bad Mickey Mantle was, because nobody in New York was going to talk about that. My God, most of them had covered Babe Ruth, and we know how bad Babe Ruth was too. But today, athletes can't get away with that stuff. So we cross that line from news journalism to sports. And to me, the sports portion of it is the game. The rest of it is news journalism.
And that's an excellent point. When I was coming up in the late 80s, early 90s, they referred to the sports department as the toy department because, you know, it's all fun and games. You're playing. We're doing the real stuff over here in the news department. And again, sometimes those do cross over. And that would be one of those, like Gary said. That's a news story involving a sports figure. And I would go so far as to say if it had been a teacher rather than a coach, it might not matter, but because it was a coach, that kind of makes him a public figure.
Yeah.
And when a coach steps down, everybody wants to know why. You know, nobody cares that the algebra teacher left and went somewhere else, except our students. But so that's kind of what made it a story. But you're running a risk, and again, in a small market, you face those decisions from time to time because you are so close to folks and you don't want to piss anybody off. But to me, the bottom line has always been one, if I didn't write the story, somebody else was going to. And I don't like being second. And professionalism.
Comes back to that. There's also, when I'm doing play-by-play, and over the years I've learned a couple things, and that is, it's a high school football player, you have to be careful what you say about him, because especially what I was doing was take the lead. The game was on Friday night and it was shown on TV on Monday. But if I said something bad about a kid, mom was on the phone Tuesday morning. Talk about her little boy. The fact that he's overweight and tried to punt a football and fell on his ass, and you chuckle. You learn not to chuckle. Yeah. Boy, there was a bunch of calls that day. Not just mom, but aunt and uncle and a sister called too. You have to be careful. My rule of thumb is the only people that are eligible for criticism are those who are being paid. Coaches, referees, high school football players, they're out there doing the best they can. Don't criticize them. I'm not going to be Howard Cosell on some high school football player. Now I may say, along the way, he's got to learn not to do that. But that's not really criticizing or making fun of him. I'll get on an official. I'll say, boy, they blew that call. And for years, I crusaded because the high schools would only mark the 5-yard markers. Right? They didn't have the individual yard markers. And I would crusade on the air. They got to put those individual yard markers out there because I got tired of seeing 5-yard penalties being stepped off at 6 yards. Somebody should have figured it out, when it was The ball was on the 34-yard line, it was a 5-yard penalty, and they stepped it out to the 40. Somebody goofed up. And I would criticize officials. They blew that call. And what happened, we found out years later, because our games were tape delayed, the head of the Officials Association was watching our games and grading the officials. Because they weren't shooting their own video, they were watching our games, grading the officials. You know what he called up and said one day? 9 times out of 10, when you guys say the official blew the call, you're right. Oh, you shouldn't have told us that.
We're going for 100 next time.
Oh, yeah.
You're right, 90%.
You shouldn't have told us that, because we were holding back sometimes. Now, oh boy, we're having fun. Coaches, hey, they're getting paid, aren't they? I don't think there's any, even in high school, nobody's coaching for free. Now, if I'm doing a youth charity game, volunteer coach, it's a charity game, come on, you treat it a little differently. But if they're getting paid, they're professionals. They get held to a higher standard than that junior in high school.
Now, to that point, there's a difference in criticizing and stating fact.
That's it.
Earlier this spring, I covered a softball game. It was a 1-0 ball game. The only run that scored reached base on an error. And I wrote about it. And the next day, the second baseman's mom, the mom of the second baseman who muffed the pop-up to short right, called me everything but a child of God, literally. But, you know, and I could not make her understand that this run scored because your child dropped a pop-up. I mean, it wasn't a hard play. It was the only run of the game. You lost 1-0, and you could not tell the story without saying that. But, you know, it was her child. I'm sorry. I wish it hadn't been your child. It was, you know. So you have to tell the story. And whatever. Now, going out of your way to go after a kid like I wanted to do with this kid the rest of the year and didn't, you know, that's different. But if in telling the story, you have to point out a play that was not positive, again, professionalism. I could have said a Columbia Academy error, blah, blah, blah. Well, what error? Who? How? What happened? You know? You don't want to write a story that creates more questions than it answers. And by trying to write around this young lady, that's exactly what I would have done. So
It happened, it's a fact.
it happens. And in small markets, sometimes you just got to have thick skin because they will come after you.
If I can, I would like to step back to the area of preparation for just a moment. And the question I'll ask you is, how prepared are you to do the job? Right now, how prepared are you to step into that profession? I was teaching a sports announcing class at Delaware State University, and it's an HBCU. We're very close to Philadelphia, and a lot of the students come from that area. And I noticed when I was stepping into the classroom every Wednesday afternoon, the guys wanted to talk to me about the Sixers and the Eagles. Sixers and Eagles. They wanted to show off their sports knowledge to the professor. That'd take me a while to get used to being called professor. Came home after the second class I ever taught, and my wife said, "How's it going?" I said, "Those kids are wise asses." They keep calling me professor. What are they supposed to call you? You're teaching their class. Oh, okay, I guess it's all right. I'm thinking they're being wise guys and giving me the razz. So they wanted to talk to the professor about sports, their knowledge. I kept telling them, you gotta learn more than just professionals, because you're not gonna start off in Philadelphia in your career. You're gonna be out in Wichita, Kansas, or a suburb of Wichita, doing Tuesday night Little League baseball games. Or you're gonna be working at a TV station and when they still did sports on local stations. Now, because of ESPN and Fox, they've kind of gotten away from that a bit. But when you're giving scores or results of tennis, check out some of the names you're going to talk about with tennis, the Eastern Europeans, the tongue twister names. What do you know about golf? Until Tiger Woods came along, a lot of those students never paid any attention to golf. Learning other sports. And I couldn't convince them of this. So the syllabus that I had, after the midterm exam, that was the only class session where there was no quiz scheduled. And I showed up that day and I said, okay, put everything away, get ready for the quiz. Professor Laing, you can't give us a quiz, it wasn't on the syllabus. Guess what, I can do anything I want. It's my radio station, my classroom. So I came up with this, and I eased their mind by telling them, you're gonna get a quiz, but it can't hurt you. Whatever you get on it, you'll get as extra credit on your quiz average. Extra credit? That's cool, give us the quiz. And then they got it. And it was titled, as soon as I click on it here, it'll come up. It was titled, What Do You Know About Sports? Now I've highlighted the answers here. Oh, you can't really see it too well. Good. And this is an example of the kind of questions they get hit with. Well, after they got about to question number 4, they realized Professor Laing had it. I pulled one on him. Former Boston Red Sox infielder Butch Hobson manages which professional baseball team? I've updated this, so this is current, by the way. Butch Hobson. The Chicago Dogs. Who's heard of the Chicago Dogs? Good. American Association, independent baseball. Not the White Sox, not the Cubs, the Chicago Dogs, which is not an actual current professional baseball league. Anybody ever heard of the American Association? It goes back before the American League. It was a major league at one time. Atlantic League. Major League Baseball currently has a contract with them. That's where they're testing out things like the computerized umpires in the Atlantic League. Can-Am League, teams in the United States and Canada. Frontier League, yeah. But the Liberty League, no, that one was made up. York Revolution, baseball team. I've been in their stadium. Atlantic League. Love to sit right behind the home plate. And when you go to independent baseball stadiums and minor league stadiums, I can afford the ticket right behind home plate. Took 2 of my grandsons to a game in York. First row behind home plate. You got the screen in front of you, right? It's a great seat. Fastball came in, the guy just happened to touch it with the bottom of the ball with his bat. It came straight back and hit the net. It hit it right at the bottom. And the next thing I knew, the ball was 3 rows behind me. Gone between me and my grandson. It ripped the net and came through. So now I sit 5 rows up. Couldn't believe that ball came through. And I didn't get the ball either. Somebody was behind us and grabbed it. Which team's not a member of the Frontier League? On that, yeah, I can see that they're highlighted now. Sugarland Space Cowboys. They started out as the Sugarland Skeeters in the Atlantic League. They got absorbed through the Major League Baseball contraction last year. And the Space Cowboys are now part of the AAA Pacific Coast League.
Gary, you know who played for the Sugarland Skeeters, right? Tracy McGrady.
There you go. We'll talk later. You can tell me who he is. I don't know. All right. This is an example that I gave to them in golf, a mulligan. I know mulligans. I use them. As many as I can buy. The sequence of 6 games in tennis is called a set. What this pointed out to these students was they didn't know as much about sports as they thought they did, and they better start learning if they wanted to go into the business. because you don't want to have a job come up somewhere where they say to you, well, you're going to cover a lot of tennis. Oh, no, I'm an NBA guy. Like, find your NBA job. Because I'm looking for somebody who knows tennis. Right?
Absolutely.
Get yourself as well educated on all aspects of sports as you can. So whatever job is out there, you're qualified.
Tell us the sports that you didn't like covering early on because you didn't understand them, didn't know them, didn't enjoy them, whatever. I mean, what was like painful to cover for each of you?
Soccer was always awful for me, still is. But I've become better at it because I've had to cover more of it. You know, I think that's the big thing. And you don't have to be an expert at it, but you do have to be credible. I mean, and that's where keeping notes, you know, play-by-play. If you can mention everybody that scored and maybe who had the assist in soccer at a high school game, you're going to be okay. Now, anything after that's kind of gravy, and there are people out there that do know soccer and do love soccer and that kind of thing. But I felt pretty good when I could actually use set piece in a sentence and know that it was the right thing at the right time. So soccer was tough for me.
For me, it would probably be track, because I hated running. Still do. If you want me to run, there better be a beer at the end of it. And I actually went out to the track team in high school and surprisingly made it because I was slow, I was small, which is why I was on the sport. The explanation is going to be that the coach didn't think it was important enough to give us all your players' names. So Mom, if you're upset tonight watching this game on Monday night, that your little boy's name has been being mentioned, call the coach Tuesday morning and ask him. You wouldn't do that. So I'm going up to the booth, we start rolling tape in 10 minutes. And I turned around and started to walk away. And I got 4 steps away from him, and I heard him yell to an assistant coach, "Hey Jim, go over to the bench, open my briefcase, make sure that guy gets one of those rosters in." Would I have done it? We'll never know. However, I know what I could have done, and that would have been go up and put on my headset and talk to the producer in the truck and tell him what the situation was. And he told me when I told him a couple weeks later what I had done, he said, we would have unpacked and not done the game. He said, you wouldn't have had to do it. I said, but it would have been so much fun. To burn the guy. And I would have told people, don't call me. You call the coach who didn't think it was important enough to make sure your kid's name gets on.
I've taken to ending emails to my coaches with, thank you for helping us cover your athletes. Because that's what we're doing. And when they fail to cooperate or choose not to cooperate or whatever it is that they're doing, that's what they're doing. They're keeping us from covering their athletes as well as we can. And every now and then they need a reminder.
And their kids deserve it. Their kids deserve the coverage. They're going out there and they're going through the practices in August 90-degree weather and putting up with being yelled at by a bunch of coaches, screamed at as if they were playing for Vince Lombardi and the Green Bay Packers. They deserve their due. They're putting out the best effort they've got. And for some of them, that's going to be the highest achievement of their life. They played on the varsity football team. Don't let a guy take it away from you because his ego got in the way. So Mr. Hyde came out that night. Yes, if it had come to that, I would have done that. I'd have burned it. I would have enjoyed every time. Don't mess with my broadcast.
Yes, sir.
As somebody who grew up right outside of Philadelphia, I want to apologize for you having lived in Delaware for the last 50 years. But my question is, being that you are that close to Philadelphia, did it ever tempt you to go up and knowing that there were, at some points, 8 professional teams there, and the 6 major colleges and everything right basically 20 minutes away from where you live.
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, so I don't like Philadelphia. Though I did become enamored with the Flyers back in 1974 when they won their first cup. And I was actually on their mailing list for news releases. Mistakes of life, you learn. I got the notification, well, if you want credentials for the playoffs, just send in the application. I thought, driving up to Philadelphia, I've got an old car, it's iffy, I can watch the games on television, I've got to be in the newsroom at 5:30 the next morning, I'm probably not. Then they got in the Stanley Cup Finals, and I'm sitting at home watching the game going, you could have had credentials here and there. But no, I never adopted the Philadelphia teams. I stayed loyal to my Baltimore teams. Even when we didn't have a football team for a while, before they even came up with the name Ravens, I was a fan of the team. So I'm a Baltimore guy. By the way, we do not have an NBA team in Baltimore, nor do we have an NHL team. But if one ever comes along and it's named the Browns, it will end up in Baltimore. The Orioles were the St. Louis Browns, and the Ravens were the Cleveland Browns. So give me an NHL or an NBA team named Browns, I'll get them in Baltimore.
Yes, sir.
So we're from Daytona Beach, Florida, and I'm on the local radio station there, 104.7 FM, and I cover the Orlando Magic. But where our town is, there seems to be kind of a dispute amongst the local coaches and the newspaper. So the newspaper actually doesn't cover a lot of local basketball, but because I have a relationship with the coaches from playing in the town, I've kind of set up a meeting with them individually about covering them. I have a website, I can write an article for myself, and then also tweet at the games, and then of course cover on 104.7. Is there a certain approach you would have with that? Because I've tried going through the Daytona Beach News Journal, and I don't know if it's because they have a dispute with the coaches or whatnot, but they don't cover local basketball.
When you say local basketball, are you talking just the Magic or?
High school basketball, because I commute to Orlando from Daytona Beach. For the
Who's
Magic.
covering Bethune-Cookman?
There used to be an individual named Brian Linder. He played football with Bethune, actually. So that's what I talked about. They have play-by-play games with Bethune-Cookman. They have no one to do high school basketball. So I volunteered my name with the coaches to do it off an individual brand instead of the newspaper. Would there be an approach that you would take, a different approach?
Start covering games.
Go, do it.
Is that the
Build
individual?
that relationship.
Build a relationship, build that up. Yep.
If you're working a team like I am with Delaware State and they hire a new coach, you got to build a new relationship. You can be the guy to bridge it.
Yeah.
And I asked about Bethune-Cookman because oftentimes the HBCUs get the hind end. And that's why my network exists. It was created by two guys who played football at Delaware State and sat down one day and said, you know what, HBCUs don't get coverage. And we can change that. And it was the time when, okay, new media, let's do it internet. We don't need a radio station to give us the okay. So the HBCUs oftentimes are very happy when you come in and want to cover it because nobody's doing it.
Thank you.
Our local newspaper in Dover stopped even coming to football games. We had a game this past year where I knew that what they wrote was based on they listened to our broadcast because they even quoted, giving us credit for it, our post-game interview with the coach. 10 miles down the road, they couldn't get their lazy asses up and come to the game on a Saturday afternoon and cover it. And they sat at home or in an office and listened to our broadcast. Wonderful. You know, one more listener. I love it. But that's not journalism. That's not being there. That's not being there. It's as bad as some of the operations and Massive, who does the Orioles and the Nationals. When the season started, still was not sending announcers on the road. They had them sitting in Baltimore doing play-by-play over the video. And they got burned for it. And finally they said, okay, we're going to send our announcers. Come on, pandemic's over from that standpoint. If the team's traveling and everything else is normal, those announcers better go. But if it's a cost-cutting measure, it's really, really bad. Pandemic, okay. You just don't want to send them. How much is another hotel room going to cost you? They're a multi-billion-dollar operation. Cheaping out on a hotel room for the announcers.
So I'm getting the signal that we need to wrap it up. So if y'all have any questions, I'd be more than happy to speak to you outside. But otherwise, we probably need to clear out for the next one. So.
Concluding statement, you can start in a small market, you can stay in a small market and have a wonderful career. I have. I've loved every minute of it. But, as Maurice said earlier, treat it as if you're working in a major. Treat it as if you're working for a network. That small market audience deserves the best you can give them. And you need to work at giving it to them.
That's it.
This is where you give us the nice parting gifts.